The morning sun cast long shadows through St. Mary's Church's stained glass windows as Sarah Martinez fidgeted with the hem of her black dress. At 16, she'd been to funerals before, but never one that made her stomach churn with such intensity. The wooden pew felt hard and unforgiving beneath her, much like the truth she carried inside. Her father, Thomas, sat beside her, his large hand covering hers in what he thought was comfort. If only he knew how his touch made her guilt worse. His eyes were red-rimmed, mourning the mother he thought he knew. Sarah watched him brush away another tear, and her heart cracked a little more. The church had filled quickly that morning. Elena Martinez had been a pillar of the community, or so everyone thought. Sarah could see Mrs. Peterson from the local charity dabbing her eyes in the third row, and Mr. Rodriguez, who ran the corner store, shaking his head in sorrow. They'd all fallen for Grandma Elena's carefully crafted image. The air felt thick with incense and unspoken words as Sarah's uncle Robert approached the pulpit. He looked immaculate in his pressed black suit, his silver hair perfectly combed. A model son preparing to honor his mother. Sarah's fingernails dug into her palms as he began to speak. "My mother, Elena Martinez," Robert's voice cracked with well-rehearsed emotion, "was the most selfless person I've ever known." Sarah wanted to scream at the irony. Instead, she watched as heads nodded in agreement throughout the congregation. She gave everything she had to her family, to this community. The eulogy continued, each word feeling like a fresh lie. Sarah's eyes drifted to the memorial display near the casket. Among the photos of Elena's seemingly charitable life, the family vacations, and the community award ceremonies, sat something that made Sarah's blood freeze: the antique lockbox. It was small, innocuous-looking with its tarnished brass finish and delicate engravings. To everyone else, it probably seemed like a fitting tribute to Elena's life, perhaps containing precious family mementos. Only Sarah knew its true contents, having discovered it just 7 days ago, while helping her father clean out Elena's attic. As Robert's voice droned on about Elena's dedication to family values, Sarah could practically feel the weight of the documents hidden in that box. The newspaper clippings, the coded letters, the old photographs that told a very different story about the Martinez family's wealth. Most damning of all, the confession Elena had written on her deathbed, too cowardly to speak the words aloud. Sarah glanced at her father again, studying his profile. Thomas Martinez was a good man, an honest man. He had no idea that his comfortable life, his mother's generosity, his entire family legacy was built on blood money, built on the death of an innocent security guard who had simply been doing his job one fateful night in 1985. The weight of the truth pressed down on Sarah's chest, making it hard to breathe in the stuffy church air. She felt trapped between loyalty to her father and the burning need to expose decades of lies. As Robert wrapped up his eloquent praise of Elena's fictional virtues, Sarah knew she couldn't let this charade continue. The truth, no matter how painful, had to come out. Her heart pounded against her ribs as Robert asked if anyone would like to share their memories of Elena. Sarah's muscles tensed, ready to stand. Sometimes, she thought, the only way to honor the dead was to expose their lies. Sarah's eyes remained fixed on her grandmother's lockbox, memories of last week's discovery flooding back. She'd been alone in the attic, sorting through Elena's belongings, when she'd found it tucked behind a false panel in an old wardrobe. The key had been taped underneath, almost as if Elena had wanted it to be found after her death. The afternoon sun filtering through the church windows caught the brass corners of the box, making them gleam accusingly. Sarah remembered how her hands had trembled as she turned that key 7 days ago. The musty attic air had seemed to thicken around her as the lid creaked open, revealing yellowed newspaper clippings and faded photographs that would shatter her family's foundation. Now, sitting in the church, Sarah could recite every word of those articles by heart. Local bank heist ends in tragedy. Security guard James Wilson, 34, leaves behind wife and infant daughter. The images of her Uncle Robert's younger face, grainy and unclear in police sketches, had burned themselves into her mind. But it was her grandmother's handwritten confession that truly haunted her. As Robert continued his performance at the pulpit, Sarah's mind drifted to the letter's contents. Alina's elegant handwriting had grown shaky near the end, perhaps from guilt, perhaps from the illness that would take her life. She detailed everything: how she'd helped plan the robbery, provided the getaway car, and spent decades laundering the money through her charitable works. The congregation sat rapt, dabbing at tears as Robert described Alina's generous donations to the children's hospital. Sarah felt bile rise in her throat. That hospital wing named after her grandmother had been built with blood money. Every scholarship, every community project, every act of charity had been an elaborate attempt to wash away guilt with good deeds. Sarah's father shifted beside her, squeezing her hand as his brother's voice cracked with emotion. Thomas had always looked up to Alina and Robert, working honest days at his construction company while they played the roles of community pillars. The weight of his ignorance pressed against Sarah's conscience like a stone. Through the stained glass windows, a police siren wailed in the distance, making Sarah flinch. She thought of James Wilson's daughter, now a grown woman who had grown up without a father. The newspaper had printed a photo of her at age 2, clutching a teddy bear at her father's funeral. She would be in her 40s now, perhaps still wondering who had taken her father away. The lockbox seemed to mock Sarah from its place among the roses and remembrance cards. Her grandmother's final words echoed in her mind. "The truth dies with me." But Alina hadn't counted on Sarah's discovery, hadn't imagined that her own granddaughter would be forced to carry this burden. Robert's voice rose in a crescendo of praise for his mother's legacy. The same hands that had held a gun that fatal night now gestured dramatically as he spoke of Alina's dedication to truth and justice. Sarah felt something snap inside her, like a wire pulled too tight for too long. The truth wouldn't die with Alina. It couldn't. Not when Sarah could still do something about it. Her legs tensed, ready to stand. The weight of 3 decades of lies pressed against her shoulders, but Sarah had never felt more certain of anything in her life. Sometimes, she thought, love meant having the courage to shatter a beautiful lie. And as Robert asked if anyone else would like to share their memories of Alina, Sarah knew exactly what she had to do. "Stop." Sarah's voice cut through the hushed church like a thunderclap. She was standing before she fully realized it, her black dress rustling in the sudden silence. Every head turned toward her, faces showing confusion, shock, and in her Uncle Robert's case, the first flicker of fear. "Sarah, honey, sit down," her father whispered urgently, tugging at her sleeve. But Sarah had passed the point of no return. Her hands were trembling, but her voice remained steady as she stepped into the center aisle. "Everything you've heard today is a lie," she announced, her words echoing off the vaulted ceiling. The church's air conditioning hummed in the background, a counterpoint to the collective gasp that rippled through the pews. "My grandmother wasn't a saint. She was a thief and an accomplice to murder." Robert's face had drained of color, his knuckles white against the pulpit. "This is grief talking," he said smoothly, but Sarah could see the panic in his eyes. "My niece has been through a difficult time." "Open the lockbox," Sarah challenged, pointing to the memorial display. "Show everyone what's inside. Show them the newspaper clippings about the first national bank robbery. Show them the security guard who died. Show them your picture in the police sketch. Uncle Robert." The silence that followed was deafening. Mrs. Peterson's prayer beads clattered to the floor. Someone in the back rows whispered, "Oh my God." Sarah's father had gone completely still beside her, his face a mask of disbelief. "My grandmother wrote a confession before she died," Sarah continued, her voice growing stronger. "She helped plan the robbery. She drove the getaway car. She helped hide the money, the same money she used for all those charitable donations everyone's been praising." Robert moved then, stepping down from the pulpit with measured steps that couldn't quite hide his urgency. "This is ridiculous. Thomas, control your daughter. She's clearly having some kind of breakdown." "James Wilson," Sarah said clearly, watching her uncle freeze mid-step. That was the security guard's name. He had a 2-year-old daughter. Every time Grandma Elena hugged me, she was thinking about that little girl growing up without a father. The congregation erupted in murmurs. Old Mrs. Rodriguez crossed herself, whispering prayers in Spanish. Sarah could see recognition dawning on some of the older faces, people who remembered the unsolved robbery, the tragic death that had shocked their small community. The money is in offshore accounts, Sarah pressed on, even as she saw her uncle's hands curl into fists. The account numbers are in the lockbox, along with Grandma's letter explaining everything. She wrote it all down, Uncle Robert. Every detail, every lie. That's enough. Robert's shout bounced off the church walls. But it was too late. Sarah could see people reaching for their phones, could hear urgent whispers about calling the police. Her father had risen slowly to his feet, his face a storm of emotions as he looked between his daughter and his brother. In the heavy silence that followed, Sarah turned to the open casket. "I'm sorry, Grandma," she said softly, but her voice carried in the quiet church. But sometimes the truth is the only prayer worth saying. The first police siren wailed in the distance, growing closer. Sarah watched as her uncle's eyes darted toward the side door, calculating. The truth was out now, racing through the church like wildfire, consuming 3 decades of carefully constructed lies. There would be no more hiding, no more pretending. The day of reckoning had finally arrived, delivered by the most unexpected messenger, a 16-year-old girl who chose truth over family loyalty. Robert's face contorted with rage as he lunged down the aisle toward Sarah. His polished shoes squeaked against the church floor, but before he could reach her, Thomas Martinez stepped between them, father protecting daughter, brother facing brother, as Elena's body lay witness to the unfolding chaos. "Get out of my way, Thomas," Robert snarled, his carefully maintained public persona crumbling. "Your little girl doesn't know what she's talking about." His hand slipped into his pocket, and something metallic glinted, a key, identical to the one Sarah had found in the attic. The congregation watched in stunned silence as recognition flickered across Thomas's face. He'd seen that key before, decades ago, on his mother's carrying. "You had a copy all this time," he whispered, pieces of the puzzle clicking into place. Every time Mom made a donation, every time she helped someone. It was all dirty money, wasn't it? Several elderly members of the congregation had risen from their seats, pointing and whispering. "That's him." Mrs. Garcia's voice cut through the tension. "I remember now, the bank robbery. He looked different then, younger, but those eyes. I was a teller that day." Robert's composure shattered completely. "You don't understand," he spat, looking wildly around the church. "That money helped people. Look at the hospital wing, the scholarships, the community center. One dead rent-a-cop was a small price to pay for all the good we did." The words hung in the air like poison. Thomas staggered back as if physically struck, his hand falling from his brother's shoulder. Sarah watched her father's world crumble in real time. 30 years of family history rewriting itself in seconds. He wasn't just a rent-a-cop. Sarah's voice rang out clear and strong. James Wilson worked double shifts to save for his daughter's college fund. He volunteered at the animal shelter on weekends. He was studying to become a teacher. She pulled a worn photograph from her pocket. A smiling man in a security uniform, holding a toddler. "This is who he was, Uncle Robert. This is who you killed." More sirens wailed outside the church now, closer. The congregation had formed a loose circle around the family drama, many recording on their phones. Robert's eyes darted between the exits, calculating escape routes, but the crowd had unknowingly blocked every path. Thomas reached slowly into his pocket and pulled out his phone. His hand trembled as he dialed, but his voice was steady. "This is Thomas Martinez," he spoke clearly. "I'm at St. Mary's Church. I need to report a murder confession." Robert moved like lightning, shoving his brother aside, but years of living soft on stolen money had slowed him down. 2 younger cousins, former high school wrestlers, grabbed his arms. A key flew from his hand, skittering across the floor to stop at Sarah's feet. She picked it up, holding it next to the one she'd found in the attic. Perfect matches, like bookends to a story of deception. Above them, Elena's huge portrait smiled benevolently, but Sarah could see it differently now. The strain around her grandmother's eyes, the guilt hidden behind her charitable smile. The first police officers burst through the church doors, weapons drawn. As they approached, Sarah looked at her uncle, really looked at him, and saw not the monster from her grandmother's confession, but a scared man who'd spent 30 years running from his own shadow. Sometimes, she realized, the biggest prison isn't built with bars, but with lies. As police sirens wailed closer to St. Mary's Church, Robert made his desperate move. With strength born of panic, he wrenched free from his younger cousin's grip, shoving aside elderly Mrs. Rodriguez as he bolted toward the side entrance. Several mourners screamed, and the carefully arranged flowers near Elena's casket toppled over. "Stop him!" someone shouted, but the chaos had already erupted. People scrambled out of Robert's path as he charged down the side aisle, his polished shoes slipping on the smooth church floor. Thomas, still holding his phone to his ear with 911 on the line, watched in horror as his brother knocked over a candlestick, sending it crashing to the ground. "He's heading for the cemetery," Sarah called out, her voice cutting through the pandemonium. She knew the layout of St. Mary's grounds intimately. The old cemetery had been her shortcut to school for years. If Robert made it to the maze of headstones and mausoleums, he might actually escape. Outside, the first police car screeched into the church parking lot, its red and blue lights painting the stained glass windows in surreal patterns. The colors danced across Elena's open casket, as if even in death she was witnessing her carefully constructed world crumbling. Robert reached the side door, yanking it open with such force that the hinge groaned. But he hadn't counted on Father Mike, the elderly groundskeeper who'd been tending to the cemetery that morning. The old man, hearing the commotion, had positioned his wheelbarrow full of dirt and stones right outside the door. Time seemed to slow as Robert tripped over the wheelbarrow's edge. He went down hard, scattering dirt and pebbles across the church steps. Before he could scramble to his feet, 3 younger members of the congregation were on him, pinning him down. Their black funeral clothes were now streaked with cemetery dirt, a fitting metaphor for the day's events. Inside the church, Thomas still gripped his phone, his knuckles white. "Yes," he spoke into it, his voice cracking. "Yes, my brother is being detained. Please hurry." He looked at the chaos around him, the scattered flowers, the overturned candle, the shocked faces of friends and family who'd come to mourn his mother, and instead witnessed the implosion of a 30-year lie. Sarah moved to stand beside her father, taking his free hand. Together, they watched through the open door as the first police officers rushed up the church steps, handcuffs glinting in the morning sun. Robert had stopped struggling, his face pressed against the concrete, decades of secrets finally catching up to him. Above them, the church bells began to toll the hour, their solemn rhythm a stark contrast to the scene below. Some of the older congregation members had started praying, their whispered words mixing with the sounds of approaching sirens and the click of handcuffs. The truth, Sarah realized, had its own kind of justice. Sometimes it arrived with sirens and handcuffs, and sometimes it waited 3 decades to emerge at a grandmother's funeral. But it always found its way into the light. The police station's fluorescent lights cast harsh shadows as Detective Maria Santos emptied the contents of Elena's lockbox onto the interrogation room table. Thomas and Sarah Martinez sat side by side, watching as 3 decades of secrets spilled out in a cascade of yellowed papers and faded photographs. "We've been looking for this evidence for 30 years, Detective Santos said, carefully unfolding a stack of letters. The handwriting was unmistakably Elena's, the same elegant script that had signed countless charitable donation checks. But these words told a very different story. The first letter, dated just days after the robbery, detailed the plan in meticulous precision. Elena's role as the getaway driver, Robert's inside connection at the bank, the exact timing chosen to coincide with the security guard shift change. Sarah watched her father's face crumple as he read his mother's confession about choosing that specific day because James Wilson was new to the job, less likely to be alert. "There's more," Detective Santos continued, spreading out bank statements, offshore accounts, shell companies, carefully disguised transfers, all leading back to the Martinez family's supposed legacy of generosity. Each charitable donation had been a calculated move to launder the blood-stained money. But it was the photographs that finally broke Thomas. Pictures of Alina and Robert celebrating with champagne just weeks after the robbery. Images of tropical vacations bought with stolen cash, while James Wilson's widow struggled to raise their daughter alone. A newspaper clipping showing Alina presenting a scholarship check to a local student, her smile hiding the dark truth behind the funds. She was building an alibi, Sarah explained softly to her father. Every good deed was meant to make it impossible to believe she could have been involved. She pointed to a series of dated entries in Alina's diary. Look, she kept track of every donation, every public appearance. She was creating a saint's reputation to hide a sinner's guilt. The detective nodded, pulling out one final piece of evidence, a recent letter addressed to James Wilson's daughter, now a grown woman living in Seattle. Alina had written it on her death, but never sent it. The confession detailed not just the crime, but 30 years of watching Wilson's daughter from afar, anonymously sending money that could never replace a father's love. "Your grandmother was thorough," Detective Santos remarked, gesturing to the scattered evidence. "She documented everything. Maybe in the end, she wanted the truth to come out." She paused, looking at Thomas with sympathy. "The DA will want to talk to you about the family assets. Most of them will be frozen pending investigation." Thomas nodded numbly, staring at a photo of his mother and brother standing in front of the hospital wing that bore their name. How many lives had been saved there, he wondered, by money that had taken a life? How did one weigh such a moral equation? Sarah squeezed her father's hand as Detective Santos gathered the evidence into official police bags. Sometimes, she realized, the truth was like a double-edged sword. It cut through lies, but it also wounded those who wielded it. Yet watching her father's straight spine and determined expression, she knew that truth, however painful, was the only foundation strong enough to rebuild a life upon. 1 month had passed since Alina Martinez's funeral, but the ripples of that day's revelations continued to spread through the community. Thomas and Sarah sat in their newly downsized apartment, sharing Chinese takeout on a folding table, one of the few pieces of furniture they'd been allowed to keep after the asset freeze. "The Wilson family's lawyer called today," Thomas said, picking at his low mien. "They want to meet with us." He looked around their modest living space, so different from their former home. The walls were bare where family photos used to hang, each one now evidence in an ongoing investigation. Sarah watched her father carefully. The past month had aged him, silver threads appearing in his dark hair, but there was something lighter about him too, as if the weight of unspoken family secrets had finally lifted from his shoulders. "Jessica Wilson, James's daughter. She sent me an email," Sarah said quietly. "She doesn't blame us, Dad. She said knowing the truth after all these years means more than any amount of money could." She pulled out her phone, showing him the message. "She wants to hear stories about Grandma Alina, to understand how someone could live with such a huge secret." Through their small apartment window, they could see the hospital wing that once bore the Martins' name. The letters had been removed last week, leaving pale outlines on the brick wall. Yet the doctors and nurses inside continued their work, saving lives regardless of where the funding had come from. "Your uncle's sentencing is next week," Thomas murmured, more to himself than to Sarah. Robert had pleaded guilty, perhaps finally worn down by 30 years of running. The local newspaper called it closure, but for the Martinez family, it felt more like a beginning than an end. Sarah stood up and walked to their tiny kitchen counter, where a familiar brass lockbox now sat empty, its contents scattered across evidence rooms and legal offices. She kept the key, though, a reminder that truth, no matter how long buried, eventually finds its way to the surface. "We're going to be okay, Dad," she said, returning to the table. "Maybe not Martinez family wealthy anymore, but okay." She smiled, remembering something her father had told her when she was small. Real wealth isn't in bank accounts, right? Thomas reached across the table and squeezed his daughter's hand. His eyes were clear now, free from the shadows that had haunted them since the funeral. "You know, your grandmother's last words to me were 'the truth sets you free,'" he said. "I thought she was just being philosophical, but now—" Sarah nodded, understanding. They'd lost their family's fortune, their social standing, and many of their so-called friends. But they'd gained something more valuable: the freedom that comes with living in truth, no matter how difficult that truth might be. As the setting sun painted their small apartment in shades of gold, father and daughter sat in comfortable silence, sharing not just a meal, but the quiet dignity of those who had chosen truth over comfort, honesty over inheritance, and the light of day over the shadows of the past.